Um, Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all for tuning in and just send a warm welcome over to our post-community session guest today, Nani Jansen Reventlow. Nani is a human rights lawyer specializing in strategic litigation and freedom of expression. She is the founding director of the Digital Freedom Fund, which supports partners in Europe to advance digital rights through strategic litigation. She is also the initiator of the Catalyst for Collaboration project, which offers best practices and case studies encouraging activists to collaborate across disciplinary silos and use strategic litigation and digital rights campaigns. Nani is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School and adjunct professor at Oxford University's Blavnitik School of Government. Sorry, it's quite early for me, everyone. So English is eluding me this morning. She's an associate tenant at Doughty Street Chambers, a senior fellow at Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute, and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where she was a fellow in 2016 until 2017. She is also an advisor at Harvard's Cyber Law Clinic since 2016 and a moderator at the Symposium on Strength and Solidarity for Human Rights since 2019. Nani is a recognized international lawyer and expert in human rights litigation, responsible for standard-setting freedoms of expression cases across several national and international jurisdictions. And it is so wonderful to be able to have her here with us today because as you can see, her breadth of expertise and knowledge is one that I think will be really quite interesting, and I cannot wait to get into it. So thank you so much for joining us, Nani.
Thank you for having me, and my deep felt appreciation for you getting so early out of bed in where you are to speak with me. I'm very impressed.
This is how much of a fan I am, everyone. Thank you so much. So I guess to just kind of get started then, could you tell us a little bit more about what the Digital Freedom Fund does and why you decided to start this organization?
Yes, very happy to. The Digital Freedom Fund supports strategic litigation on digital rights in Europe. By digital rights, we mean all human rights as engaged in the digital context. So not just civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And by strategic litigation, we mean a litigation that can have an impact that goes beyond the case itself, so that can bring about more systemic change. We do this in two different ways. We provide financial support for strategic cases that have the potential to advance digital rights. And we also engage in organizing opportunities for those who are working on digital rights to connect with each other, to coordinate with each other, to further develop skills. So those are basically our two main activities.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's very cool. I mean, we'll get more into everything related to DFF and digital rights and this thing called strategic litigation. So I guess then for anyone who's tuning in and maybe this isn't a geek topic area that they're interested in like ourselves, how do digital rights exist within the human rights framework? Because I think when many people envision human rights, they envision torture and generally some sort of loss of life and, you know, kind of tragedy porn-esque images are evoked when you hear human rights. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess like the more traditional conception of digital rights was indeed like privacy, data protection in particular, and freedom of expression online. But as more and more of our lives are actually moving into the digital context, and I think that this is something of which awareness has grown quite a lot since the pandemic started, right? We're working from home. We are, some of us need to kind of like access education through digital means, access to medical service, etc. There's a lot of things that we're doing electronically, actually, and with the assistance of technology. And technology is also playing a bigger and bigger role in a lot of processes that we're not entirely aware of, such as delivering of essential government services. So it touches upon so many aspects of our lives that it actually engages with also all of our human rights in those specific settings. So yeah, it's indeed a lot more than just privacy, just freedom of expression. And even like you mentioned the example of torture, there's we actually have an interesting publication on our website also, like how that interacts with technology. And there are many other things where you perhaps not necessarily would make that link initially, but it's there.
No, that makes sense. No, that definitely makes sense. And I think you had mentioned, and I guess, could you give examples of the ways in which maybe it links that, and I don't know, just in ways that we're not necessarily seeing?
Well, at the moment, for example, the right to health, right? The right to education, the right to reproductive rights. In the context of International Women's Day, right, which took place earlier this week, we published a series of posts that are looking at digital rights as women's rights. One of those pieces is written by someone from an organization whose litigation we are supporting, and they are challenging the blocking of a website in Spain that provides access to reproductive information. And the argument there is basically that, in particularly in times like now in a pandemic, when it's more difficult than ever perhaps to kind of like physically go and see a doctor, it's essential that this kind of information is available online. So basically access to information has an impact on reproductive rights of women.
Someone's reproductive rights. Yeah, that's really quite fascinating. That's very interesting. And you've mentioned strategic litigation. So then I guess the question is, what role do courts play in the context of digital rights?
So I guess it's kind of also ties into your earlier question, like how do digital rights fit into the broader human rights framework, right? Because we're in a situation where we have a wonderful framework to protect our human rights. And the question is, like, how does this actually pan out now in the digital context? As technology is developing so quickly, how can we make sure that our human rights remain safeguarded in that context? And the courts play a crucial role in that. Courts generally are used to using existing frameworks and applying them to new contexts. And what we are seeing right now is like courts trying to figure out like how does the right to privacy work in the digital context? How does the right to non-discrimination work in the digital context, etc. So the courts have an important role, not only to, on the one hand, reaffirm that our human rights should be protected in these specific settings, but also to help us identify if there are any gaps in the current framework that we have. Are there any things that are slipping through the cracks? And then you can think about like national legislation, like are the means that we have sufficient right now in making sure that all our human rights are protected? So this is a role that the court can play, and in that sense, they play both the reaffirming, and they also can play a role in forming standards, but also guiding the way as to where legislative efforts should be directed.
Okay. That's very interesting. And I guess because we all know that members of the judiciary do tend to be of a certain demographic age, how, I guess, are we seeing them handle and grapple with ideas of, when they might not necessarily know what TikTok is, and someone brings litigation regarding TikTok and they're asking their judicial assistant to download so they can even see. Have you kind of come across that or heard anecdotes?
You're making me feel very old right now, because I've never been on TikTok. I've only seen TikTok on other platforms. So I'm not quite sure if I'm of the ripe old age to be a judge yet. Putting aside that there are a number of really young judges out there as well. But you are right that it's important that people kind of like handling these types of cases really kind of understand how all of this works, and that is a problem. And I think also that there is a lot of scope there for additional capacity building, additional training for judges. But there's also, well, not only judges, but also law enforcement and the legal system and apparatus more generally, right? Because if you think, for example, about the way that prosecutors are not always handling cases of harassment and online bullying, etc., in the proper way. Also sometimes because they are not given the proper means. I will also say that. But there's scope for further development all around. But there's also a role for those who are litigating, right? In kind of helping the court get to a place where they fully understand the issue and how they understand how the technology kind of interacts with the legal question that they're being asked to pass judgment on. And there's an important role there in making sure that as a lawyer, you try to kind of make sure that the practical aspects of the case, so the technology and how it works, is explained in an accessible manner to the court. So this means working together with other experts. I'm so sorry. Working together with experts who are able to kind of like make that translation from from the code, so to speak, to what it actually means in everyday life for us. There's some nice examples from the UK where there was a case at some point that concerned defamation via Twitter, in which like some of the amicus briefs were actually explaining how Twitter worked. You know, what does a retweet mean? Like where does it go? You know, because those things are all very important when you're thinking like how far has a message spread in a defamation. That's relevant to know. So yeah, just as an example.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And I think we've obviously been talking about the courts a bit. So just shifting a bit more specifically to strategic litigation, what role it plays in the long-term development of digital rights, and then what we can accomplish, I guess, in court to protect our human rights in a digital age vis-a-vis strategic litigation.
Yeah. So when we're looking at strategic litigation, it's important to keep in mind that it's more than just a court case. What makes a case strategic is the fact that it's embedded in a broader strategy for change. So you're not just thinking about the legal strategy and how you are going to convince a court or a judge or a set of judges that your approach is the right one. But you're actually trying to think ahead, like, what am I going to change outside this courtroom? What is this judgment going to mean? And that means that you also really have to very carefully think about like the communications around the case. How do you communicate the issue to a broader audience, to a broader public, to make sure that if you win, that there's also sufficient support for good implementation, for example. You also probably want to do advocacy work related to the case, kind of like using the case as a lever to push on other fronts for the change that you're trying to bring about. And all of this is extra important when you think about the fact that also sometimes cases are lost, right? But it doesn't always necessarily have to mean that it's also a loss for the cause that you are pursuing. There are instances in which people have been really good at communicating the broader issue at stake around the case, generating public debate, so that even if the court didn't find in their favor, by that point, the general public was so kind of like engaged with the issue that, for example, a push was made for legislative change that was going to bring about the same end result that you're pursuing. So this is how strategic litigation can play a role in pursuing any kind of like bigger systemic change, including for digital rights.
That's very interesting. I love basketball, so definitely strategic litigation seems like a full court press kind of way of making change. Takes the activism, takes the law, and brings it all together wonderfully. And a full court press is definitely a solid basketball strategy. So I'm sure it's been, and I know it's been working with digital rights. So yeah, that's very interesting. And I guess now switching, because we've, I guess, spoken about the mechanical aspects, but now just kind of looking at, I guess, other aspects of digital rights and just how, I guess, it plays out in the lives of those who are marginalized and outside of the margins, to first discuss how power structures, I guess, are reproduced through technology in our digital rights or in our digital lives, because I think that in understanding that, it'll probably help us better understand also why we need to make sure that we have an exhaustive breadth of firm digital rights that are, good for people.
Yeah, so there are a number of factors that kind of like play into this reproduction of power structures in the technology that we create and that we use. Like, my short answer there is always like, if we live in a racist, sexist, ableist, etc. society, we are going to produce technology that kind of replicates that, right? But there are different things that kind of like go into the mix. I think a really important thing to always keep in mind is that technology is not neutral. Like we always kind of like still have this assumption that, well, if the computer says it, it must be correct because it's just a machine. It's not going to kind of like, this is just not true because for one, like everything that we design implies design choices, right? The people who create the technology in a way are replicating their preferences, they're replicating their perceptions of what a quote unquote average user is, what an average user, whatever that is, would want or what they should want to do with the technology. So a designer and the people who build the technology are kind of like replicating their worldview in what they build. Then there's another issue, which is that overall the people who are designing and building the technology form a very homogeneous part of our society. It's been described that as for Silicon Valley, where a lot of our technology comes from, here in Europe and also in the US, has a programmer problem, has been called. The idea that overall the design and engineer core is overall white, Western, able-bodied, etc. And if you look at the numbers of representation of other categories, if I can put it that way, of people in Silicon Valley, it's like the numbers are so low that you can often not even see them on a graph, right? And that says a lot about where and how the technology that we use is being designed. Then there is the third problem, which is that the technology is built and developed often and trained on data that already reflect systemic bias or discrimination that we already see in our societies. So if you use, again, like if you use data from a society that is racist, sexist, ableist, and all the other things, to train new software, it can be new and shiny and whatever and do all sorts of fantastic things, but it's going to replicate those existing biases. So you're going to see that again and again. And one of the things that, and then the last thing I would want to flag is that there's a problem in the sense that the teams that kind of work on the designing and building new technology are not multidisciplinary teams. So like there's often no perspective from sociologists or from human rights lawyers or other types of experts involved in this to kind of like look at these things a little bit more holistically than purely from the tech side. So yeah, these are some of the factors that play into it.
No, definitely. And I think from there, then I guess if you could give examples of how maybe we see this technology or just technology in general, maybe enabling unequal treatment as a result. Is there, any sort of example or any case that you've been working on or thinking about a lot?
No, I think
there's tons of examples, but one that interests you.
How much time do you have? No, but I think like an example that everyone probably will be familiar with by now is the whole debate around facial recognition technology, right?
Yes.
And that is like a prime example of reproducing the designers' worldview and also their own kind of like their own experience, in the sense that facial recognition technology that comes from Silicon Valley is primarily good at recognizing white male faces. And if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, it has a really hard time identifying you. So that says a lot. And this is not to say that, I'm not advocating actually that we make the technology better, because I don't think that we should be using facial recognition technology at all. But it is a good example of like how, oh, this is an average person, me, white guy, and completely forgetting about the rest of the population and actually not building the technology on that. And also training the technology on data sets that, apparently nobody noticed weren't very representative at the time.
No, definitely. And I know that there's, I think Liberty has been working on some strategic
Exactly.
litigation within the United Kingdom
Yeah, successfully
surrounding
so.
it.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah.
so there's some really nice advances in that area, right? So indeed, the case that Liberty brought in the UK, which challenged the use of facial recognition by the police, was
Yeah.
successful. And then also, of course, last year we saw a number of the big tech companies giving some slightly qualified, putting a slightly qualified halt to some of their facial recognition development activities. So
Yeah.
but in and of itself, it's maybe better than nothing. But it was allegedly to kind of like give space for this debate. But what is really nice to have seen is that in the US, for example, a number of municipalities decided to not use it
Yeah.
at all. So yeah, this debate definitely needs to continue and vigorously so. And not only
That's
just about
true.
the question as to whether or not it's discriminatory or not, um, it's also just a question, should we want to actually create technology that can flawlessly recognize every single one of our
Yeah.
faces? Like, do we want that kind of surveillance state?
Yeah.
Those are fundamental questions to ask first, I think.
No, definitely. And I think if you are aware of the surveillance, then it's definitely a technology that I think you're quite not on board, aside from the potential use by law enforcement and border agency and so on and so forth. I remember the first visa that I got for the UK, and they did even like a retinal scan. I was like, oh, there we go, Big Brother has it. So it's very much, I think, something that we do need to pause and look at before, we're years down the line and
Yeah,
looking back and
yeah.
wondering where did we all go
Yeah, and
wrong.
we can't roll it back, right? And this is why I actually don't think it's that bad to just be a little bit more cautious. I mean, there's always this narrative about technology, just kind of like technological developments, just kind of like racing along and overtaking us and whatever. It's like we are still the ones who are producing it. Like, so we do have
We have
control, and
control.
yeah, we should exercise it also.
Definitely. And I think then from that, in maybe not wanting to have surveillance and all sorts of other digital realities, how can we kind of fight for our digital rights and challenge this discrimination as a maybe layperson?
Yeah, by remaining very vigilant, right? I think it was a couple of years ago that I kind of like expressed the concern that we're kind of asleep at the wheel. This
Yeah.
we fought really hard and long for our human rights and for our civil liberties, and in the offline context, and now we're kind of like giving it away pretty easily for a trade-off for like comfort, for convenience, etc. I think that whenever there's whenever no such thing as a free lunch, right? So whenever there's a free service, or there is like a whole long set of terms and conditions for some app or other, etc., you should really pause for a moment and really think like, what am I actually signing away? What am I allowing them to do with my data? And to be really, really careful and aware of the fact that even seemingly innocent data can, in the end, be weaponized against you. Because you don't know where they're going, perhaps. You don't know with what other data sets they're going to be combined. So there's a lot of risks there. So asking critical questions, being very vigilant, and also just, there's a whole bunch of wonderful toolkits out there that help you kind of make sure that you use the internet more safely, right? And that you don't end up getting all your data, handed over to data brokers who are building profiles for you to target you with advertising and whatnot. So there's a lot of tools that are pretty easy to use. Choosing a security favorable browser, using Firefox, for example, or Brave or something like that. And there's a whole bunch of things there that you can do, and not just assuming that because someone is asking you to click a button that you really have to.
No, that's really great. And I know you've mentioned browsers, but are there any kind of specific toolkits too? Because I'm sure many people come across the terms and conditions and are just like, this is too daunting, or maybe they're worried that there's legalese that either maybe simplify and say that, you know, when you sign up for a Twitter account, you can expect this and this and this data. If you could give examples or names for people watching who are maybe thinking it's time to tighten it up.
This is a really good question, actually. I'm going to kind of do a little bit of research and kind of send you some links, so maybe we can kind of post those later.
Yeah,
but
sure.
but I know that, for example, Tactical Tech has a number of toolkits that kind of allow you to actually see, for example, how much information is out there about you online, and also offers opportunities to kind of like, you know, take your rights back to to the extent that that is possible. There's a lot of like there's security in a box type, you know, digital security toolkits, which are also very helpful. But let me collect a couple of links and share them with you, and then
yeah, definitely, and then we'll circulate. Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. So then I think part of the discourse, or I guess I've been thinking a lot about decolonization just in light of these new, in the United Kingdom, considerations of, I think, an increase from 3 months to 10 years for defacing colonial statues, which, yes, that's another conversation for another day. But, you know, I think that generally there's been just a lot more decolonization energy and I think thought in everything from education to now data. And I guess then my question is, how should we understand what is meant by the decolonizing process when we're discussing digital rights?
So, well, first of all, fully acknowledging also that decolonizing is almost becoming like one of those buzzwords that everybody uses for everything.
The discourse.
But when we started thinking about this in the context of the digital rights field in particular, because decolonizing digital rights is a much bigger question, and that's like, of course, tied into the much bigger question of like, how are we going to decolonize our societies, right? And that's which is the ambition we should have, but which is a pretty big project also. Why we use the term in the context of the work that we're doing at the Digital Freedom Fund in partnership with European digital rights is that we want to kind of like indicate that we're really thinking about how can we change the power structures that are holding the digital rights field in place as it currently is. How can we start bringing about change that means that we're having different conversations about digital rights with different participants, which will create different agendas and different priorities for the digital rights field. So yeah, it's really to kind of make clear that it's not about, you know, what is diversity and inclusion. Like, we don't think it makes sense to want to bring in more people into a system that needs fixing. So we really want to figure out how we can do something to, you know, change the ecosystem itself.
For sure. I think that's quite interesting. I guess how then would, or how could we recommend, or how then can we maybe engage more in a decolonizing process when we're dealing with digital rights, our digital rights, the digital rights of others, if we are someone that works in this area?
Yeah,
I think things we should be thinking about, or
we as individuals.
Is there a better way we can?
Yeah, I think I think it extends in a similar way as, like, you know, being more aware of your digital rights in general. It's about like awareness, right? And it's a continuous process of learning and trying to colonize your own mindset, and then kind of being aware of that when you are thinking about our human rights in the digital context. So in that sense, it's kind of like it's intertwined with this general kind of becoming more aware of like how we interact with technology, how that impacts our lives, and how that also impacts the lives of people who are not us, right? So that is a key part of it. So, and like, so we are only just like with the work that we're doing, we only just got started, right? So it's about a year ago now that we started with an initial process that we call process of listening and learning, in which we basically focused on speaking to those organizations and individuals that we're currently not seeing in the room when we're talking about digital rights here in Europe, to understand like to what extent digital rights are relevant for their work. When you are fighting for racial, social, economic justice, like how do digital rights tie in with that? Do people have experience working with digital rights organizations? How has that been? And also kind of asking people what their vision is for a decolonized digital rights field. And also talking to organizations that have been working on digital rights, like to what extent are you taking issues of racial, social, and economic justice into account in your work? And how do you see a decolonized digital rights field, and where do you think that that could go? To really kind of like get a sense of like, what is this beautiful blue skies vision, right, that we can go towards, and what is at the end of the rainbow, at the end of the journey? We're now kind of at a stage like following those conversations, and also having had a gathering with different stakeholders to kind of really do this visioning exercise, and also think like what the next steps should look like. We're getting ready for a design process, which is going to be a collaborative design process to actually come to a program that can set this process into motion. So it's slow but steady, because like it's a big task. It's something, but we do feel that we kind of need to get started on it, because it's just so urgent. And we're excited and hopeful about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, what then is your kind of digital blue sky ideal for digital rights? What is maybe the end goal that you envisage, if that is something that can be extrapolated?
We did a very fun visioning exercise during the gathering, in which we were trying to imagine headlines for the future. I think that someone sent Jeff Bezos into outer space, and Amazon had been turned into a workers' collective, and all of those things. So, there were some really wonderful ideas out there. But I think overall, like the common thread kind of through that all was that like these fields, if we can call them that way, that are currently working on racial justice, social justice, economic justice, climate justice, digital rights, that those would actually become more and more intertwined, and collaboratively we're working for like a much more holistic view of our human rights in these different contexts. So hopefully some of the fun headlines might also come true, but that would be really wonderful to see.
Yeah, it would be very cool. I'm definitely fingers crossed for their unionization efforts in the United States that are ongoing, that hopefully they're successful. But yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's quite. And I do think that we are definitely seeing more of, I think, even the fact that environmental justice, even though technically it was the 80s in which there were calls by, of course, racialized environmental activists who said that, you need to include race in this. And I think that we kind of plodded along. Some people did, most people didn't. And so I do think we're definitely at, I think, maybe a point in which I think more and more there is an increasing awareness and understanding that actually we do need to look at things and how they can intersect and intertwine and work together positively and negatively, and consider that in the solutions that are being I think proposed, so that they're holistic solutions and not maybe solutions that we think, oh, okay, we've done feminism now, and it's like, well, hello, sorry, you forgot some of us. So, yeah, that's great.
Ongoing process.
Definitely. Yes. I think then my final question, I might have a follow-up, but my final kind of big question is, I guess, what are ways, which you've kind of stated, but I guess what are ways that we can continually just ensure that we're engaging in our digital rights, engaging in the protection of not only our digital rights, but the digital rights of maybe more vulnerable groups, and ensure that they are protected? Is there organizations to get involved in, things to donate to? What are kind of practical steps that if I leave this and I wonder, okay, how else can I help with this thing called All rights, big D, big R, like human
Absolutely.
rights, big H, big R. Yeah.
So there are so many wonderful organizations out there that are working on digital rights, and so many that also kind of really focus on national issues. So that's sometimes a little bit easier, right? To kind of like step into something that relates to closer to home. And I also think that is super important, right? Because you often see that, you know, what one government gets away with, the next government will try as well. So I mean, those local conversations are super important. And I was so very happy to see such vigorous debate emerge around like Corona apps, etc., on a national level. Whenever governments were starting to kind of say like, okay, here's this app, we're going to make it mandatory. And it's like, wait, like where,
Yeah.
what are you going to do with all those data? Like what is going on? So find out what local organizations there are that work on digital rights, and follow them. Subscribe to their newsletter, follow them on Twitter, so you can kind of like, you know, they keep you sharp, right? They will be the ones who will be saying like, oh, you know, these new measures that have just been announced, it sounds great, and look at all of these concerns that we have, like, and government should be listening to that, and then you can get involved at a level that's really accessible. And another thing, I guess, that will be really good to do is what I said before, is just kind of like for you as a consumer, since we're still living in a capitalist society, as a consumer, like be aware of your power as well, right? I mean, it's just crazy a little bit if you think about like how many gadgets are being developed at the moment that basically just assume that we all want to be tracked continuously and want to kind of like have all our apps interconnected and whatever. Like, we're only going to get things that are privacy by design on a structural level if we also demand it. And again, there are other organizations that really kind of like work on that. I think Some of Us, for example, is one of those. They're really kind of in Bayuk here in Europe, and there's the different national consumer associations that are really actually kind of like looking at like, well, you know, what you are being sold is really very bad for you, and they will help you make better choices, and they will also allow you to kind of like join more collective actions to kind of demand better products, not privacy invasive products. So yeah.
I think, yeah, that's all fantastic. And I hope that everyone who is watching definitely considers and thinks and I guess pauses when they sign up for the next thing. So that's, I think, yeah, that's quite interesting. I think just the question that I've seen come in that I think is quite interesting is, I guess, how in the digital rights conversation, how do you kind of, I guess, geopolitics play out? So TikTok, for example, being a Chinese developed brand or software, and the point in which the United States, at least under the Trump presidency, was talking about banning it, and how does that, I think, kind of play out? And then does that cause a differentiation in maybe the privacy and data issues if it's developed in one place versus in another place? Or do we actually see this being played out in many, that if the same way they might steal data in one place, actually probably how they're stealing it, and even if it's an American design, that's because it's American doesn't necessarily maybe mean that, oh yeah, they respect your rights a little bit more than maybe a Chinese design product. But
I definitely think that assuming that US design would respect your privacy more is probably not not the way to go.
Edward Snowden.
So it definitely matters, right? Geography matters a lot. I think at the moment, like, Europe considers itself, I think, the front runner a bit when it comes to privacy, because there's regulations like the GDPR, and to some extent that also forces some of the bigger global companies, social media companies, tech companies, etc., that want to kind of like have access to the European market to comply with those standards, which is a positive thing. But that, of course, like leaves a huge, the majority of the world, basically, where technology is also designed and is also produced and under in a completely different legal regime, and perhaps also because perhaps different traditions as to like whether or not, you know, privacy is something that should be prioritized over other interests. And yeah, I think also there's another thing to kind of like keep in mind, and that is also that we, like here in Europe and in North America, have a certain perception of like what the technology is that everybody uses, right? Whereas there's a lot of very, very local apps and social media platforms, etc., that we are used by like so many people, but we are just not that much in contact with it. So I think that the idea that there's some sort of like universal approach to technology and how you use it, etc., at this point in time doesn't really work. So yeah, it's definitely a patchy landscape with very different outcomes. I think the one thing that you do kind of like see as a recurring factor, no matter where, is that governments often will kind of resort to a narrative of tech solutionism when it suits them. Pandemic was a very good example of that. You know, enthusiastically supported by big tech companies, and also that you know, the debate about like who should be regulating, for example, online platforms and so on, is going to be hard in all of those contexts, because what might work as a solution, quote unquote, in one setting might have super detrimental effects in another one. So it's really about figuring out like where to find a balance that might be workable for everyone.
For sure. And for anyone who isn't maybe familiar with the idea of tech solutionism, could you just quickly explain?
Sure. Sorry. No, that's the idea that technology is going to save us. Technology is the answer. Like there's a deadly virus going around. Like, why don't we give everybody trackers so we can know where they've been and we can trace who's been in contact with whom and who we should be putting into quarantine? Or like other really creepy things that happened. I think, where was that? I think that was in Poland, where you had to take a selfie at regular intervals because if you went to quarantine to show that you were at home, you know, just. But it's basically the idea that technology is going to save us all, because it's going to bring all the efficiency and all the firepower and all the capacity that we need to kind of solve all of our problems. So.
Which, yes, I mean, I don't know if that's the case.
Again, technology is man-made, so like, you know, it's
yeah. And so at Pulse, Human Rights Pulse, we're focusing on women's issues or surrounding women's rights issues and just anything to do with women. We're looking at it this month in greater detail, at least trying to look at it as much as possible, even though there's a lot of things that unfortunately affect women. So I do have a couple of questions just about, I guess, technology and where it intersects with gender. And so one of my questions then was, with a kind of greater recognition of the gendered aspect of the digital divide, is it fair to ask if technology is inherently sexist, or to say if technology is sexist and walk away and mic drop?
I would say technology is sexist and racist and ableist, etc., and then drop the mic on it. So that would be quite a much longer list. So, so definitely it's a yes and, you know, answer, and it's a yes and all of the things that I just mentioned. And I think it's really important to kind of like stick to an intersectional approach when we ask those questions, and also when we look at the impact of technology on our lives, for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier on when we're talking as to like, why do these power structures get reproduced? Gender is an important aspect in all of that as well. So for sure.
And I guess increasingly, or how maybe, or why, because for people who maybe don't understand why women are maybe being left behind or not included, because we know, at least the understanding of the digital divide was first between, you know, the global north and the global south, and how is it maybe now shifted to somehow also impact gender? How are women maybe not necessarily getting access to gender, or maybe being more distrustful of, access to technology? How are women as a gender being not necessarily maybe having as much access to technology, or being more mistrustful of technology and kind of the use of data, but companies, because I think statistics have said that women actually tend to be more distrustful of technology and data than surprisingly men.
It's good if they're naturally suspicious of, you know.
Yeah.
No, but jokes aside, like I think a lot of that is manifestations of, again, like bigger power dynamics at play, right? In specific contexts, it's about it's like, where is the technology placed? Did you have access to it or not? It's similar kind of like things that play into, you know, the idea that women would be less adapt to exact sciences, etc., and therefore perhaps less drawn to, I mean, we know that all of that is nonsense, and that it's just like reproduction of, you know, bias that we have towards what suits specific genders or not, which is all made up and a construct. But yeah, you'll see that trickling down in all of these other contexts as well.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think you know, Slay's tweet that actually you replied, so that I'm one of, I think maybe a colleague or a friend with Apple being like confirming that during women's cycles they have cramps, and
Yes,
it was just very ridiculous. That okay, Apple. I definitely saw great replies of, you know, men being like, "Oh, cycle tracking. I thought it was a bicycle."
I guess we're now moving from mansplaining to big tech-splaining of you know, like that's, no, but there's, I mean, there are so many examples of like technology working out really terribly for women, and indeed, like, you know, the whole idea of these cycle app, this cycle app, fertility apps and so on, with like huge data privacy issues that were basically kind of like referred to therefore as like a gold mine for stalkers, because they were so easy to hack that you could find out all sorts of private medical information of the women that used it. The notorious situation of like certain job ads being shown predominantly to users, internet users that, you know, the algorithm thought were men. There was a famous example last year also with again with Apple, by the way, with the Apple credit card, that it was giving a lower credit line to women than to men, like that. But like, also just to kind of like put that into the mix, overall, just the perception that gender has to be looked at in a binary way, like, you know, there's software being developed to kind of like assign people a gender, and it's just like literally, as they call it, male or female, like, and that's it. So yeah, there's so much that needs to be addressed there.
I mean, I guess the benefit is if you're not on the binary, maybe there's less good data on you. You're arguably slightly more, but also then you're also being left out of the kind of technology data.
Well, there's that. But then, for example, if you think it through even a little bit further, right? The idea that you should be able to classify people in a binary manner, and then what does it mean that if the software doesn't think that you're classifiable, like what risk does that expose you to, right? Because if you can think of all sorts of like nefarious ways in which you can use that to actually harm people who present as non-binary, to exclude them from certain services, whatever. So there's all sorts of stuff that goes into that. It's like, oh, okay, that might not have been the intention of the people designing this piece of technology, but this definitely should have been part of their risk modeling at the outset, and thinking through what the impact actually is of what they're about to develop.
Definitely, I think there's always a danger of technology outing people, especially in maybe who are in more vulnerable and dangerous contexts. But as you say, suddenly if you're not being given access to certain services because, like, oh well, you're neither man or woman, and yeah, that is concerning. And so my next one is I know in Mexico there's been this huge passing of a law called Olympia's Law, and so increasingly we're kind of seeing more legislation that targets the distribution of sexually explicit images or videos of individuals without their consent. So as this thing dubbed revenge porn disproportionately affects women, is digital privacy kind of a feminist issue, or is there a way to look at it through maybe a more radical, critical feminist lens?
Yeah, first of all,
just like radical, not that. Clear that up in case anyone's like, oh, they're our organization. We're not.
Yeah. So I guess my really kind of like annoying answer there is like, this should be an issue of concern to all of us, and not just feminists out there. But yeah, like the privacy issues that I, for example, just flagged also when it comes to like what they really nicely call like femtech, all the medical apps that let us track all sorts of things, and the lack of concerns for privacy there are a huge issue. I think the fact that quite often the response to issues such as revenge porn, and I'm not even talking about like necessarily legislating against it, right? Because there's all sorts of difficult trappings there also when it comes to freedom of expression, etc., that need to be considered, and not creating legislation that can be weaponized against free speech. But it's also an issue of like the priority that these issues are actually given in the justice system. Like, to what extent are law enforcement given the tools and the resources to actually properly investigate, to properly prosecute? And it's and that actually says a lot more about the choices in our societies and what we consider to be priority issues than about the issue itself, right? I mean, we see this pattern in so many different contexts. It's in healthcare, in whatnot, right? It's all about like, who do we prioritize? Who should be given the most protection, and who are we willing to kind of like invest in? Whose protection and safety are we willing to invest as a society? So yeah.
It's definitely, I think there's something that's very interesting because I think, at least in the Mexico context, it's quite fascinating. But with the kind of activism surrounding, because the woman's name is Olympia, so I think that's why they've named it. Or I don't think it's actually titled that, but at least in the mainstream. So it's interesting because then, of course, you have on International Women's Day, Mexican women protesting in front of the president's residence, the fact that they have the highest like global femicide rates, but yet Mexico's probably patting themselves on the back for the fact that, oh no, but we've now targeted the improper sharing of explicit images of women, so how can we have an issue with women? So it is quite, I think, as you say, maybe more important to look at how or what is society prioritizing, and where, rather than, oh cool, we've legislated against that. The United Kingdom legislated against upskirting, yet a young woman unfortunately went on a walk and was found murdered. So it's just, yes. I'm just going to check to see if anyone has submitted any more questions. Okay, I think there's no other questions. I don't know if you have anything else that you want to say, and just kind of summary or wrap up, anything that you want people to think about. Any last words that you're like, oh, she didn't ask about that.
Well,
but the world must know.
my message to the world. No, I think if I'm allowed to kind of like give a reading suggestion, is that we published on International Human Rights Day last December Digital Rights Are Human Rights publication, which is really nice to kind of like illustrate how digital rights are human rights. So all these different kind of like aspects that you may not automatically think of when you think of digital rights. Culture, right to work, etc. Like there's right to equality. So there's all sorts of nice short pieces there from guest authors from our network. So I'd really recommend that. And this week we published something that's digital rights are women's rights, women with an asterisk rights, to kind of like show an intersectional feminist perspective on digital rights. So those are 5 short pieces also, like asking questions like, does AI harm LGBTQI people? Why do we need a feminist infrastructure, tech infrastructure? Things like that. So I would encourage people who are interested in learning a bit more to check those out. And you can find those on our website, that is digitalfreedomfund.org. So.
Okay, that's super cool. Definitely link it when we repost whenever. And yeah, that's fantastic. And then if you also send me some kind of toolkit resources, then maybe we can do another kind of push and to link it to people so that they can.
Good. We'll get everyone to be safe on the internet. Wonderful.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. Watching this on the internet, let's hope you help yourself.
On Facebook, no less. But
yes, yeah. I have so many issues. Yeah. But I'll be on everywhere else, guys, I promise. So if you're not on Facebook, don't worry, you'll still get get to engage. But yeah, oh goodness gracious. Yeah, thank you so much again. Thank you. So there's like a 20-second lag on Facebook. So I'm just gonna have us hang for a second and then end it. Just so that it all saves correctly. But yeah, thank you so much for spending, I guess, your late afternoon, early evening with me and the rest of the Pulse community. And yeah, I'm glad that we were able to do this. I think it's been really a lot of fun to speak to you and super insightful and really engaging. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.